Tonight, we uncover a truth the Church was never meant to speak. A truth buried beneath Latin prayers, redacted texts, and burned pages. It begins with names. Names that echo through exorcisms, that haunt the margins of forbidden grimoires, and that never appear in Scripture the way they do in Vatican archives. These are not medieval fantasies or theatrical inventions. These names have roots, ancient ones, older than Christianity, older than Rome. Names summoned from Babylon, carried through Egypt, filtered through Jewish mysticism, and rewritten under the watchful eyes of theologians who knew exactly what they were doing. The Vatican knows where they came from, and more importantly, why they were kept. This is not just a story of demons. It is a story of control. Because to name something is to command it. And for centuries, only a chosen few were allowed to speak these names out loud. So before you settle in, ask yourself why these names were hidden, and what happens when they are finally said aloud again. Like the video and subscribe. What comes next might not let you forget them. There is a name that echoes through the halls of religion, legend, and magic alike. Solomon. Not as a myth, but as a figure rooted deep in Scripture. His reputation, carefully preserved across centuries, is that of a king gifted with divine wisdom. A man who ruled a golden age in ancient Israel, who judged between disputes, wrote sacred proverbs, and commanded wealth beyond imagination. But there is a side of Solomon rarely spoken of. A darker reflection that emerges not from the Bible, but from books that came centuries later. Books that claim he could command spirits, summon angels, and seal demons beneath the earth. How did this transformation happen? How did a king become a magician? And what does it mean that his name still sits on the cover of spellbooks kept hidden by libraries and whispered about in secret circles? Solomon is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as the son of King David and Bathsheba. He took the throne around the 10th century before Christ. The first book of Kings says he ruled for 40 years and built the first temple in Jerusalem. But more than his political reign, it was his wisdom that made him legendary. The Bible says that when offered anything by God, Solomon asked not for riches or victory, but for understanding. This request was granted, and he was described as wiser than all men. Tales about him judging a dispute between two women over a child became symbolic of divine justice. But while the Bible ends its praise with warnings about his later turn to foreign gods, other stories were just beginning. Centuries after his death, Solomon's name began to appear in writings far outside the Jewish or Christian canon. In the apocryphal text called the Testament of Solomon, likely written between the 1st and 3rd centuries after Christ, he is described not just as a wise ruler, but as a sorcerer who commanded demons to build the temple. He supposedly used a magic ring given by the archangel Michael to summon spirits, interrogate them, and bind them to his will. This text does not belong to any official scripture, but its impact was huge. Later magical books, including grimoires written in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, would borrow heavily from it. This transformation is not an accident. By the time the Islamic world preserved and translated ancient Greek knowledge, including works on astrology, medicine, and occult science, Solomon was already considered a master of hidden knowledge in both Jewish and Arabic traditions. In the Quran, he is known as Sulaiman, and is also described as having power over the wind and jinn. This created a shared belief across 3 religions that Solomon had access to forces beyond normal human control. But as these ideas passed into Europe through Spain and Sicily, something changed. The Solomon of Scripture became the Solomon of spell books. Books, like the Key of Solomon and the Lesser Key, claim to hold ancient rituals, symbols, and instructions allegedly passed down from the king himself. But historians know they were written more than 1,000 years after Solomon lived. Still, they used his name as a seal of authority, because if Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, practiced magic, then surely it must be divine. And that is the beginning of a deeper story. A story that winds through hidden texts, church censorship, and the vaults of the Vatican itself. Solomon was never meant to be a magician. In the Hebrew Bible, he was a king, a judge, a temple builder. But by the time the Roman Empire had crumbled and Europe drifted into the early Middle Ages, something strange began to happen. His name started appearing in texts that had nothing to do with the Bible. Rituals, invocations, diagrams, and incantations. Solomon, once a symbol of holy wisdom, was now being presented as the ultimate master of the occult. And the question no one seems to ask is this: how did Scripture turn into spellbook? The answer lies in a slow process of reinterpretation, fusion, and invention that unfolded over centuries. By the 3rd century after Christ, Christian and Jewish communities were already circulating stories beyond the official scriptures. The Testament of Solomon, one of the earliest magical texts to use his name, claimed the king used a divine ring to control demons and build the temple. It described the spirits he summoned, what powers they had, and even how they could be used. The demons were given names, roles, and voices. Some caused sickness, others stirred conflict, and many had to be interrogated before being banished. This was not simple storytelling. It was a manual, one that blended biblical names with something closer to ancient Greek magical traditions. At the same time, Egypt had become a center for a different kind of writing. The Greek magical papyri, collected and copied between the 2nd century before Christ and the 5th century after, were full of spells, symbols, and invocations that mixed Greek, Egyptian, and Jewish elements. Some of them even referred to Solomon. This shows how his name was already being used across cultures to add legitimacy to magical practices. The figure of Solomon was being slowly reshaped, not erased, but reimagined as a spiritual technician. A ruler not just of men, but of the invisible world. By the time Europe entered the Middle Ages, this version of Solomon had taken on a life of its own. Monks and scholars began translating Arabic texts that preserved ancient Greek science, astrology, and esoteric lore. Many of these texts had been filtered through Islamic philosophers, some of whom viewed Solomon as a prophet with divine knowledge of the heavens and the unseen. As these works reached Latin Europe through Spain and Sicily around the 12th century, the lines between religion, science, and magic grew thin. Solomon was no longer just a biblical figure. He was a name used to frame entire systems of ritual magic. What emerged was a fusion. Writers compiled texts filled with angelic names, astrological timings, purification rituals, and protective prayers, all structured around the idea that they came from Solomon himself. But they didn't. These books were anonymous, copied by hand, altered, and expanded by different scribes in different languages. Yet they all carried the same idea: that somewhere, long ago, Solomon had discovered the secret language of the spirits and passed it down. And even though there is no historical evidence he ever wrote a single spell, his name became the gateway to a tradition that still survives today in the shadows. There is a book that has travelled through centuries, cloaked in mystery, and marked with the name of a king, the Key of Solomon. It claims to be the ancient manual of King Solomon himself, containing powerful rituals to summon spirits, purify tools, and gain control over hidden forces. But when historians examine its origins, a different picture begins to emerge. The book is not from ancient Israel. It is not from the time of the temple. Instead, the evidence points to Europe, specifically to Italy, during the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, sometime between the 14th and 15th centuries. This is where the Key of Solomon was truly born, and it was not written by Solomon. The Key of Solomon is what scholars call a pseudepigraphical work. That means it was written by someone else, but attributed to a famous figure from the distant past to give it more authority. This was common in the ancient and medieval world. People believed that if a text claimed to be from Solomon, it must hold divine wisdom. But, in truth, the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Key of Solomon are in Latin, and none of them are earlier than the 14th century. The structure, vocabulary, and magical systems found in these texts point to a European origin deeply influenced by earlier Arabic, Jewish, and Greek magical traditions that had already been circulating in translated form. What makes the Key of Solomon different is how organized it is. Unlike chaotic collections of spells or scattered magical papyri, the key follows a clear format. It describes when to perform rituals, how to prepare tools, how to draw protective circles, and what words to say. It includes detailed instructions on animal sacrifice, planetary timing, angelic invocations, and cleansing rites. But all of this is framed within a religious and spiritual system that echoes Catholic ritual structure. This reflects the mindset of the late medieval scribe, not the ancient king, and this is important, because the text was not created in a vacuum. It was shaped by a world where Christian monks copied forbidden texts in secret, where old Jewish magical traditions were being repackaged in Latin, and where Renaissance thinkers were reviving interest in the occult sciences. There are dozens of manuscript versions of the Key of Solomon scattered across European libraries. No two are exactly alike. Some are in Latin, others are in Italian or French. Some include strange diagrams and sigils. Others leave them blank. Some speak of angels. Others name demons. But all of them claim to come from the same source, Solomon. This claim is not historical, it is symbolic. It tells us that whoever wrote these texts wanted them to feel ancient, sacred, and powerful. And they chose Solomon's name because, by that time, he had become the ultimate symbol of divine magic. What we are left with is not a single book, but a tradition. A tradition that took shape during a period when Europe was rediscovering ancient texts, rethinking science, and quietly blending magic with faith. The Key of Solomon was never found in the ruins of Jerusalem. It was written in the candlelit corners of late medieval Europe, and what it reveals may not be what Solomon practiced, but what people believed he could have known. There is no single version of the Key of Solomon, no original copy sealed in glass or carved in stone. What survives instead are dozens of handwritten manuscripts, each slightly different, each shaped by the hand and mind of the person who copied it. For centuries, this book did not exist as one fixed text. It moved, it changed, it adapted. And every time a scribe put pen to parchment, they left behind a new version of the same mysterious tradition. That is why modern scholars do not speak of the Key of Solomon as one book, but as a family of texts, a living manuscript tradition that drifted over time. The oldest surviving versions of the Key of Solomon are from the late 14th or early 15th century. Most are written in Latin or Italian, but there are also French, English, and even Greek copies that appear later. They are found in libraries across Europe, from the British Library to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and even within the Vatican itself. What they all have in common is the structure. The book is usually divided into two parts. The first part explains how to purify the magician, tools, and space. The second part contains spells, talismans, and spirit names. But once you look closer, the differences begin to appear. In one version, a diagram might contain Hebrew letters. In another, those same symbols are replaced by astrological signs. The names of spirits change. The prayers shift from long invocations to short commands. Some manuscripts include detailed planetary charts. Others have blank pages where images were meant to be drawn, but never were. In one copy, the text may say, "To use the blood of a black rooster." In another, it says to avoid blood entirely and only use holy water. These changes are not accidents. They show that each copyist had a choice. Some may have altered the text to reflect local traditions. Others may have removed or added content based on what they believed was safe, effective, or spiritually acceptable. Copying by hand was never a neutral act, especially with magical texts. These books were often illegal or heavily restricted. So when someone decided to reproduce the Key of Solomon, they were taking a risk. They may have worked in secret, inside monasteries, private homes, or underground networks of occult study. And because of that secrecy, they were free to modify the text as they saw fit. They could omit prayers that felt too dangerous. They could insert personal notes or adjust rituals to fit the tools they had. Over time, these choices added up, and the Key of Solomon became not one voice, but a chorus of variations. This explains why historians struggle to define a single original version. It likely never existed in the way we imagine. Instead, the text evolved with every generation that kept it alive, a magical manual that never stopped moving, a tradition that never stood still. And behind each copy, a shadow of the person who believed it had power. Solomonic magic did not spread in the open. It was never taught in universities or preached from pulpits. Instead, it moved quietly through Europe, passed from hand to hand, hidden in plain sight. It lived in the margins of society, in the minds of those who read Latin, who had access to parchment, who could copy texts without attracting attention. Scribes, monks, physicians, and educated readers became the hidden carriers of this strange tradition, not because they were rebels or heretics, but because they believed that within the rituals and symbols of the Solomonic texts there was something worth preserving, something powerful. During the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, literacy was still limited. Most people could not read or write. But among the clergy, scholars, and certain medical professionals, books were a part of daily life. These were the circles where grimoires could survive. A monk working in a scriptorium might copy a religious text by day and quietly transcribe a magical one by night. A physician trained in herbal medicine might also own a manuscript on planetary timing or angelic seals. These individuals did not see magic as superstition. They saw it as another form of knowledge, something that required discipline order, and faith. The Key of Solomon was one of many texts that moved through this underground network. Others included the Book of Abramelin, the Ars Notoria, and later, the Lemegeton. These books often included prayers, invocations, and tools that closely mirrored the structure of Catholic rites. They were not wild spells written by peasants or charlatans. They were carefully designed systems, written by people who were familiar with theology, scripture, and ritual practice. This made them harder to detect, and easier to justify if discovered. After all, if a prayer mentions God, angels, and sacred purification, could it really be heresy? But this secrecy came at a cost. The fear of discovery was always present. The Inquisition, though focused mainly on religious heresy and witchcraft, also targeted certain books. By the 16th century, the Catholic Church began formalizing censorship through the Index of Forbidden Books. Magical texts, especially those claiming to summon spirits or alter the natural order, were often included. Owning or copying them could result in punishment. So those who continued the tradition had to be careful. They disguised their copies, hid their notes, and sometimes used code words or symbolic language to protect their meanings. Despite this, the tradition survived, not because of organized schools or public support, but because of individuals who believed that Solomon's wisdom had not been fully understood. They operated outside the spotlight, often in isolation, keeping alive fragments of a system that blurred the line between magic and prayer. These were not sorcerers in towers. They were monks in candlelit libraries, doctors with hidden pages in their journals, and quiet readers who believed that truth was sometimes hidden on purpose. Solomonic magic became a thread woven into Europe's intellectual underground. Invisible, but never gone. When people hear the word Vatican, they usually think of churches, popes, and sacred texts. But there is another side of the Vatican that most have never seen. A library. Not just any library, but one of the oldest and most important manuscript collections in the world. The Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana. Founded officially in the mid-15th century by Pope Nicholas V, it quickly became the central archive for the Catholic Church's intellectual heritage. Its shelves hold more than 1 million printed books and over 80,000 manuscripts. Among them are works on theology, science, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and quietly, learned magic. The term learned magic refers to a specific kind of writing. Not folk spells or superstitions, but highly structured, scholarly texts that often combine religious language with technical ritual procedures. These texts were usually written in Latin or Greek. They were copied by monks, scholars, and physicians, and many of them referenced ancient sources like Solomon, Hermes Trismegistus, or even Pythagoras. The Key of Solomon, while not officially part of the library's public catalogue, represents the type of material that flowed through Europe during the same centuries when the Vatican Library was being built. These works did not always get labelled as magic. Sometimes they were filed under natural philosophy, angelology, or cosmology, but the content revealed deeper intentions: how to summon, how to purify, how to speak to the invisible. The Vatican did not openly endorse such writings, but because its mission was to preserve the full range of knowledge, many of these texts entered the collection through inheritance, donation, or conquest. During the Renaissance, popes actively acquired rare manuscripts from Greek monasteries, Islamic libraries, and European noble families. This was not always about control. It was also about curiosity. The Church wanted to understand the roots of all intellectual traditions, and that included the ones it often spoke out against. Some of the manuscripts stored in the Vatican Library contain astrological diagrams, planetary charts, and references to figures like Solomon and Enoch. These texts are not always available to the public. Access is restricted. Scholars must apply for permission, specify the manuscript they want, and follow strict guidelines. No one is allowed to wander freely. No photos, no copies taken home. This system has fueled centuries of speculation. What else lies behind those walls? What texts have never been catalogued? And what knowledge remains in the shadows because it does not fit the Church's current narrative? It is important to understand that the Vatican Library is not the same as the Vatican Secret Archive, now called the Apostolic Archive. The library focuses on preserving human knowledge. The archive focuses on official church records. But the line between them is not always clear, especially when it comes to manuscripts that mention spirits, invocations, or names, like Solomon. Rome's other library holds more than just history. It holds the echoes of questions the Church has never fully answered. Questions about what it chose to keep, and what it chose not to share. For centuries, the Catholic Church walked a narrow line between protecting spiritual truth and confronting the growing curiosity of scholars. This tightrope was especially visible in how it treated knowledge that blended science, ritual, and the unknown. On one side stood natural philosophy, the study of the world and its laws, a field the Church tolerated and even encouraged when it served theology. On the other side stood conjuring, the use of rituals and symbols to summon spirits or manipulate forces outside of Christian doctrine. The problem was the boundary between the two was never clear, and many of the texts that blurred that line carried the name of Solomon. Natural philosophy in the medieval world included fields like astronomy, medicine, and the study of elements. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century argued that human reason could be used to understand God's creation as long as it stayed within the limits of faith. But what if a philosopher used planetary movements to predict events? What if a physician used herbs combined with angelic names? What if someone read the Key of Solomon and saw it not as superstition but as a lost science? This is where the Church faced a deeper challenge. It wanted to protect souls, but it also wanted to control who had access to spiritual power. During the 12th and 13th centuries, European scholars began translating Arabic texts that contained ancient Greek knowledge, along with astrology, alchemy, and ceremonial magic. Some of these works were attributed to Solomon, others to Hermes, or other legendary figures. They used complex diagrams, long prayers, and secret symbols. Many of them looked like religious texts, but served magical purposes. Church officials could not ignore them. Some parts resembled accepted theology, other parts crossed into forbidden territory. So rather than reject them outright, church scholars began classifying them. The distinction became a matter of intent. If a text was used to understand God's creation, it could be tolerated. If it tried to command angels or demons without divine permission, it was considered dangerous. This distinction was not always fair or clear. It gave church leaders the power to decide what was safe and what was sinful. The same ritual could be viewed as sacred or heretical, depending on who performed it and why. That is why some monks could copy grimoires without punishment, while others were exiled or worse. By the time the Index of Forbidden Books was established in the 16th century, the Church had developed a more formal system of censorship. Books linked to spirit invocation, astrological timing, or non-Christian cosmology were banned, but many of them had already spread too far to be erased. Copies were hidden, reworded, or passed in secret. The Church never fully erased Solomonic magic. It tried to contain it, to draw a line between acceptable knowledge and forbidden power. But that line moved with time, politics, and fear. And the tightrope between faith and forbidden knowledge remains suspended even now. In early modern Europe, the most dangerous thing a person could own was not a weapon or a forbidden relic. It was a book. Not just any book, but one filled with symbols, prayers, and instructions that claimed to unlock hidden powers. Grimoires, like the Key of Solomon, the Book of Abramelin, and the Ars Notoria, were not just read, they were hunted, and the hunters were not soldiers. They were inquisitors. Men trained not only to defend the Church, but to expose, examine, and eliminate anything they saw as a threat to the soul. To them, these books were not just texts. They were evidence, and sometimes a form of spiritual infection. The Inquisition was not a single group. It developed in stages. The medieval Inquisition began in the 13th century to fight heresy in southern France. Later, the Spanish Inquisition was established in the late 15th century, and the Roman Inquisition in the 16th. Each had different rules, but they shared a purpose: to protect the faith by investigating beliefs, behaviors, and materials that could lead people away from church doctrine. This included witchcraft, secret sects, and eventually, books of magic. If someone was caught with a grimoire, especially one that claimed to summon spirits or use the names of angels outside official rituals, it could be seen as direct rebellion against divine order. Grimoires were treated not only as forbidden knowledge, but as proof of contact with evil. If someone confessed to using one, or if a copy was found during a raid, it became part of the trial. It was studied, quoted, and presented as evidence that the accused was involved in sorcery. But the danger was not just the content. The Church feared that these books could spread ideas like a disease. One person might copy it, another might perform a ritual. A third might begin teaching it, and suddenly, what began as a private experiment turned into a network of belief. That is why the Inquisition read everything. They wanted to trace the path of knowledge back to its source, and cut it off. Sometimes the punishment was mild: confiscation, public penance, or a ban on future study. Other times it was severe: imprisonment, torture, or even death. The severity depended on what the person did with the book, whether they confessed, and whether they were part of a larger group. There are records of men and women burned for owning texts that included the Seal of Solomon, or for drawing ritual circles, or for writing names of spirits in strange alphabets. These were not just signs of curiosity. They were taken as signs of spiritual rebellion. Despite this pressure, grimoires survived. They were hidden in walls, buried in graves, passed through secret networks, and sometimes disguised as innocent texts. The fear of the Inquisition made people cautious, but it also confirmed the power of these books in the minds of those who believed in them. If the Church feared them enough to burn them, maybe there was something real inside, something worth protecting, something worth reading in the shadows. Not all books were burned. Some were simply banned, silently, systematically, and for centuries. In the 16th century, the Catholic Church created one of its most powerful tools for controlling knowledge: the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. The Index of Forbidden Books. First issued in the year 1559 under Pope Paul IV, it listed titles considered too dangerous for the faithful to read. These were books that challenged church doctrine, promoted heresy, or explored subjects that the Vatican believed should not be questioned. And among them, scattered between philosophy and theology, were books that dealt with magic. Not just stories or fables, but grimoires. Instructional texts like the Key of Solomon that taught how to summon spirits, use astrological timings, or control unseen forces. These were not treated as harmless superstitions. They were viewed as contagious ideas, and the index was designed to stop them from spreading. The index was not just a list, it was a system. Every few decades, the Church updated it with new titles, authors, and categories. Scholars, printers, and booksellers had to follow its rules. Monasteries were ordered to remove offending books. Universities were told to teach only approved materials. Owning or copying a forbidden book could lead to investigation or punishment. And this was not just about protecting faith. It was about defining the boundaries of truth. When the Church declared a book forbidden, it was saying that certain questions could no longer be asked, certain knowledge could no longer be pursued, and in that silence, control was maintained. The Key of Solomon itself was rarely printed during the time the index was active. Most copies existed in manuscript form, handwritten and passed in secret. But books that resembled it, books that taught ceremonial magic or referenced hidden knowledge, were included. Works by Agrippa, Paracelsus, and later occult writers were banned. So were texts on astrology, necromancy, and spirit invocation. The Church did not need to confiscate every grimoire. It only needed to create fear around them, to mark them as spiritually toxic, and to let that warning echo through the minds of readers for generations. By the 17th century, the index had grown into a vast document, covering thousands of titles. But enforcement was not always consistent. In some regions, it was strict. In others, it was ignored. Secret libraries flourished. Hidden copies circulated. And even inside the Vatican itself, some forbidden texts were preserved under scholarly protection. The contradiction was clear. The Church banned certain books in public while quietly preserving them in private. Not to read them widely, but to study, control, and contain their influence. The index continued until the year 1966, when it was officially abolished by the Vatican. But by then, its legacy was already embedded in the structure of European knowledge. It had shaped what was allowed to be studied, what was passed down, and what was forgotten. And the most dangerous books were not the ones that were burned. They were the ones that survived in silence, copied by hand, hidden away, never allowed to circulate. Because some truths, once read, cannot be unlearned. For most of European history, Latin was more than just a language. It was a gate. If you could read Latin, you were part of a world of scholarship, religion, and hidden knowledge. If you could not, that world stayed locked. And when it came to Solomonic magic, Latin was both the lock and the key. The oldest known versions of the Key of Solomon and similar texts were written in Latin, not because Latin was ancient, but because it was the language of the Church, of university learning, and of serious ritual. This gave the text an air of authority. It also kept it out of the hands of the untrained. In medieval and Renaissance Europe, literacy was not universal. Most common people could not read or write. Even fewer could read Latin. This meant that texts like the Key of Solomon circulated mainly among monks, clerics, physicians, and scholars. These were the people who had access to books, libraries, and education. They could interpret the complex instructions, understand the references to angels, planets, and Hebrew names, and follow the structure of purification, timing, and invocation. This was not casual reading. It required preparation, and that made it exclusive. But over time, things began to shift. Starting around the 15th century, some versions of the Key of Solomon and related grimoires began to appear in vernacular languages. Italian, French, German, and later English copies started to circulate. These were often handwritten and sometimes incomplete. They allowed non-clerical readers to access the rituals and diagrams, but they still carried traces of the original Latin structure. Many included untranslated words, symbolic codes, or ritual phrases left in Latin for effect or protection. The idea was simple. The language itself held power. Changing it too much might weaken the results, or worse, invite danger. This balance between secrecy and access kept the tradition alive, but hidden. A farmer might never see a grimoire, but a city-based apothecary or a nobleman with a private library might own one. And even among educated readers, there was hesitation. Because Latin was not just a tool, it was a shield. If someone found a Latin book with mysterious diagrams, they might dismiss it as scholarly or religious. But if the same book was in plain language, it could be seen as witchcraft. Latin provided a layer of protection, a way to keep the rituals out of reach unless you had earned the right to read them. This pattern continued for centuries. Even after the invention of the printing press, Solomonic texts remained mostly in manuscript form. Printed versions were rare and usually appeared much later, often disguised or mislabeled to avoid censorship. The language helped control who could learn, who could practice, and who could challenge the official version of truth. Latin was not just a choice. It was a filter, a way to separate the curious from the committed. And in the world of hidden magic, that separation was everything. By the middle of the 17th century, a new book began to circulate among occult circles in Europe. It was not a single work, but a compilation made from older manuscripts, filled with seals, names of spirits, and detailed instructions for summoning and control. It came to be known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, or, in Latin, the Lemegeton. This book did not replace the older Key of Solomon, but built upon it. It took the idea that Solomon had once commanded spirits and expanded it into a full system of ceremonial magic. The Lesser Key was not ancient, but it felt like it was. And that illusion made it powerful. The Lemegeton was likely assembled in England sometime in the mid-17th century. Scholars believe it was compiled from multiple earlier sources, some going back to the 13th or 14th centuries. It is written in English, not Latin, which made it more accessible, but also more dangerous. It gave direct instructions on how to contact spirits, what to say, what tools to use, and how to protect yourself during the process. It included drawings of magical circles, symbols, and seals, each connected to a specific spirit. Unlike the Key of Solomon, which focused heavily on purification and spiritual preparation, the Lemegeton was more focused on technique. It was a manual for results. The book is divided into 5 main parts. The most famous is the first section, known as the Ars Goetia. This part lists 72 demons, said to have been summoned and controlled by Solomon himself. Each demon has a name, a seal, a rank, and a list of powers. Some promise knowledge of the past and future. Others offer invisibility, treasure, or influence. The rituals to summon them involve precise timing, the use of sacred names, and the drawing of specific circles for protection. The remaining 4 sections include the Ars Theurgia Goetia, which deals with spirits of the air, the Ars Paulina, focused on angels and planetary hours, the Ars Almadel, which involves a magical wax tablet, and the Ars Notoria, which is more meditative and uses prayers to gain knowledge. Even though the name Solomon is used throughout, there is no evidence that the real historical Solomon had anything to do with this material. The Lemegeton was clearly a product of its time. It reflects the growing interest in systematizing magic, cataloguing spirits, and building a structured cosmology that could be practiced by educated occultists. It also shows the influence of earlier Christian and Jewish magical traditions, merged with Renaissance ceremonial practice and even touches of alchemical thought. Because it was in English, the Lesser Key spread more widely in Protestant countries, where church censorship was less centralized, but still present. It became one of the most copied and circulated grimoires of the modern era. And even today, it remains one of the most referenced books in Western occultism. The name may be misleading, but its impact is not. The Lesser Key gave shape to the idea that Solomon's power could be mapped, repeated, and used, not just in legend, but in practice. As the Vatican grew in power and its libraries expanded, so did the rumors. By the 18th century, the idea that the Church possessed forbidden knowledge had taken deep root in the European imagination. Scholars, travelers, and storytellers alike began to speak of the Vatican as a place where secrets were locked away, where ancient scrolls and magical books were hidden from the world. Whether it was true or not no longer mattered. The belief itself gained momentum. The Vatican became the symbol of control over knowledge, and soon every dangerous book, whether real or imagined, found its home behind Roman doors. The Bibliotheca Apostolica Vaticana was founded in the mid-15th century and quickly became one of the most important manuscript collections in Europe. Its holdings included theology, science, history, and philosophy. But because access was tightly controlled, the contents remained mysterious to the outside world. Only approved scholars could enter. Only specific texts could be viewed, and copying was strictly limited. This secrecy, meant to protect delicate materials and prevent the spread of heresy, had an unintended effect. It made the Vatican a perfect target for speculation. Writers across Europe began to describe the Vatican as a place where dangerous knowledge was buried. Voltaire, a critic of the Church, joked that the Vatican must be full of banned texts that contradicted official doctrine. Romantic poets and Gothic novelists followed, filling their pages with visions of dusty shelves, ancient grimoires, and forbidden rituals, all hidden beneath the Vatican. Even serious historians began to ask what exactly was kept out of sight. The Church never denied that it held rare and controversial texts, but it rarely explained what they were. By the 19th century, the myth had become larger than the truth. The idea that the Vatican held copies of every banned grimoire began to spread. Some claimed the Key of Solomon was there in its oldest form. Others whispered that the Lemegeton, the Book of Enoch, or even the lost writings of Hermes were locked in a sealed vault. The Church, of course, never confirmed these claims. And that silence only fueled the mystery. The less people knew, the more they imagined. There is no hard proof that the Vatican holds the original copy of any Solomonic grimoire. But it does contain manuscripts that reference magic, astrology, and ancient ritual. Some of these are labelled as heretical. Others are preserved as part of historical collections. What is clear is that the line between preservation and suppression is often thin. A text can be kept, not to promote it, but to control it. And when the most powerful religious institution in the world builds walls around its knowledge, stories will always find a way to fill the gaps. The image of the Vatican as a vault of lost wisdom still shapes how people talk about forbidden books. It does not matter if the stories are true. The belief that the Church hides what it fears continues to echo. And the Grimoire of Solomon, whether or not it sits on a shelf in Rome, remains part of that echo. The deeper scholars dig into the world of Solomonic magic, the clearer one problem becomes. There is no original, no master copy, no single grimoire that all others descend from in a straight line. What exists instead is a scattered collection of manuscripts, fragments, and translations, all pointing back to something that no one can fully reconstruct. This is known as the lost grimoire problem, and it has puzzled researchers, collectors, and occultists for centuries. The mystery is not just about what is written, it is about what is missing. Somewhere in the past, there may have been an early version of the Key of Solomon or another core Solomonic text that shaped everything that came after. But that version has never been found. The oldest surviving manuscripts of the Key of Solomon date from the late 14th or early 15th century. Most are in Latin or Italian. Some appear more complete than others, but none of them agree on every detail. One might include a prayer to archangels, while another replaces it with a diagram. A third might contain a list of ritual tools that does not appear anywhere else. Over time, scholars began to realize they were not reading copies of one book, but versions of a tradition. A tradition that had changed with each new scribe, each new translation, each new culture that touched it. This leads to the question that haunts every study of Solomonic magic. Was there ever an original? And if so, what did it look like? Some believe there may have been an early Jewish magical text, possibly written in Hebrew or Aramaic, that laid the groundwork for later Solomonic manuals. Others argue that the tradition grew slowly over time, blending Greek, Arabic, and Christian elements until it formed the structure we see in the medieval manuscripts. In either case, the earliest source has not survived. Or, if it has, it remains hidden, mislabeled, or misunderstood in some forgotten archive. Collectors in the 19th and 20th centuries added new layers to the mystery. As more manuscripts were discovered in private collections and university libraries, they began to notice patterns, similar layouts, repeated phrases, identical symbols in texts written centuries apart. This suggested that even though the texts were different, they were all echoing something older, something that was already seen as authoritative before any known version had been written. The search for that missing archetype became an obsession, not just for historians, but for those who believed that the original text might hold greater power. The lost grimoire problem reminds us that magic, like myth, survives through fragments. The power of the Solomonic tradition does not come from one perfect book. It comes from the belief that such a book once existed, and that its wisdom, scattered across pages, symbols, and rituals, can still be found if you know how to look. the missing archetype is not just a historical puzzle. It is a mirror of how hidden knowledge works, always just out of reach, always pointing back to something older, deeper, and deliberately concealed. The most revealing parts of a grimoire are not always in the main text. They are in the margins, the small notes scribbled in fading ink, the crossed-out words, the awkward substitutions, the missing pages replaced by hand-drawn symbols or prayers in a different handwriting. These are the signs of use, of change, of personal involvement. They show that grimoires like the Key of Solomon were not treated as sacred, untouchable objects. They were working manuals, and as they moved from owner to owner, they were reshaped to fit the needs, beliefs, and fears of the people who used them. What survives today is not just the tradition, it is the trail of those who altered it. Across Europe, manuscript copies of Solomonic texts reveal evidence of this quiet customization. A scribe in 15th century Italy might replace a Hebrew name with a Latin one. A user in 17th century France might add a new charm for healing or change the name of an angel to match a local saint. These were not mistakes. They were decisions. Adjustments made to bring the ritual closer to what felt familiar or effective. Sometimes these changes were practical. A ritual that called for tools or ingredients hard to find might be simplified. Sometimes they were protective. A prayer that looked too suspicious might be rewritten to sound more Christian. And sometimes they were experimental. A new diagram might be added to test its power, or borrowed from another text entirely. These layers of annotation form a second voice in the manuscript. They show how readers interacted with the material, how they questioned it, tested it, and reshaped it. One manuscript might have symbols that appear nowhere else. Another might include a Latin comment in the margin explaining why a certain prayer was dangerous to speak aloud. In some cases, entire pages were restructured. Lists of spirits were rearranged, circles redrawn. Even the names of demons or angels were sometimes changed, reflecting shifts in theology, astrology, or popular belief. This pattern was not unique to the Key of Solomon. Many magical texts from the same period show similar signs of adaptation. But the Solomonic tradition in particular seems to have encouraged this kind of interaction. Its structure invited personalization. The rituals were complex, but flexible. The language sacred, but open to reinterpretation. And because there was no central authority controlling how the text was copied, each version became its own reflection of local practice. Today, scholars use these marginal notes to trace how the text moved. A small change in phrasing might reveal the influence of a different magical school. A swapped diagram could point to a link between two regions. These details turn each grimoire into a historical map, not just of ideas, but of people, of how they read, how they believed, and how they acted on those beliefs. The trail of marginal notes is the hidden record of a living tradition. It proves that the Key of Solomon was never frozen in time. It was always in motion, always being shaped by hands that dared to make it their own. Behind the high stone walls of the Vatican is one of the most carefully guarded collections of texts in the world. The Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, founded officially in the mid-15th century, has preserved some of the oldest and rarest manuscripts ever written. While most people assume its shelves contain only sacred texts, church histories, and theological commentaries, a closer look at its catalogue tells a more complex story. Among the carefully preserved documents are works related to medieval learned magic. Some of these texts contain content that modern scholars would classify as Solomonic, even if they are not labeled as grimoires or presented to the public as books of magic. The Vatican has always maintained a deep interest in knowledge of all kinds. During the Renaissance, popes and church officials actively collected books and manuscripts from across Europe, the Byzantine Empire, and even the Islamic world. These collections weren't limited to scripture. They included philosophy, science, mathematics, astronomy, and esoteric writings. The Church believed that to understand and guide human knowledge, it had to preserve it. That decision meant that even controversial or dangerous texts found a place in the Vatican's archives, including materials dealing with astrology, angelology, spirit hierarchies, and ritual magic. Among these documents are texts that contain prayers, diagrams, and invocations that closely resemble the structure of Solomonic magic. Some manuscripts feature the names of angels and spirits found in the Key of Solomon, or the Lemegeton. Others describe purification rituals, planetary hours, and symbolic seals. Many of these manuscripts were not originally written as grimoires. They may have been classified as treatises on natural philosophy or theological cosmology. But the content reveals deeper connections to ceremonial magic. These texts were written by clerics, monks, or scholars who operated inside the boundaries of church learning, even as they explored practices that would later be labeled as occult. Vatican codices such as Vat.Lat. 3859 and Vat.Lat. 7286, for example, contain materials that include magical prayers, exorcisms, and ritual formulas. Other texts like the Liber Razielis and the Ars Notoria have appeared in copies housed in the Vatican, often accompanied by commentary or annotations in Latin. These books use sacred language, reference biblical figures, and follow ritual structures that overlap with Solomonic traditions. They do not announce themselves as grimoires, but their contents suggest otherwise. Access to these manuscripts remains highly restricted. Only approved scholars can view them, and even then, permissions are limited. No public images, no general circulation. This level of control continues to raise questions. Why preserve these texts if they are not meant to be read? Why keep them classified in ways that obscure their magical nature? The Church's official answer is preservation of historical record. But the secrecy has fueled centuries of speculation about what else might be hidden in the shadows of the Vatican Library. What the Vatican actually holds is not a single lost grimoire. It is a vast network of manuscripts that reflect how deeply Solomonic magic was embedded in the intellectual and spiritual traditions of medieval Europe. And while the Church may not advertise it, the evidence is there for those allowed to see. When people talk about hidden knowledge in the Vatican, they usually imagine a single secret place where forbidden books and mysterious scrolls are locked away. But in reality, there are two different institutions, and confusing them has created one of the most persistent myths in modern history. The first is the Vatican Library, a scholarly collection dating back to the mid-15th century. The second is the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive. The name alone has caused endless speculation, but the truth is more complex than it sounds. The Vatican Library was designed as a research center for church scholars. It holds a massive collection of books, manuscripts, and printed materials covering theology, science, literature, and history. Some of its contents include texts that touch on astrology, ancient philosophy, and even magic. But its purpose has always been academic. Scholars from around the world can apply for access, and while strict rules still apply, parts of the collection are well known and even published in academic catalogues. The Apostolic Archive, on the other hand, is not about public scholarship. It is the official storage space for centuries of papal documents, letters, and administrative records. This includes coronation records, diplomatic communications, trial transcripts, and even personal notes from popes. The term secret archive does not mean what many people think. In Latin, the word secretum originally meant private, not hidden. The secret archive was simply the Pope's private archive, separate from the public library. But once that name reached the wider world, it took on a life of its own. Writers, conspiracy theorists, and even filmmakers began to imagine it as a vault of lost relics and banned texts. Over time, the myth grew stronger than the facts. People began to speak of the secret archive as the place where the Church hid its darkest truths, including magical texts like the Key of Solomon or the Book of Enoch. In 2019, the Vatican officially changed the name from the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive, hoping to stop the confusion. But by then, it was too late. The myth had already become part of popular culture. When people hear about hidden books in the Vatican, they picture shadowy corridors and chained volumes containing dangerous rituals. They do not think of indexed papal correspondence or church court proceedings. This confusion has helped keep the idea of a Vatican conspiracy alive. And in that gap between truth and imagination, Solomonic legends continue to grow. The real mystery is not just what these institutions contain. It is why the line between them was never clearly explained. By keeping the archive and the library under layers of restriction and formal language, the Church gave space for fiction to grow. And when it comes to books of power, sometimes the silence speaks louder than the facts. People do not need proof to believe something is hidden. They only need the feeling that someone does not want them to look. In the year 2019, Pope Francis made a decision that corrected one of the most misunderstood labels in the history of the Catholic Church. He officially changed the name of the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. At first glance, this might seem like a small change, but its purpose was clear. The word secretum, long misunderstood by the public, had caused centuries of confusion. In Latin, secretum never meant secret in the way we think of it today. It meant private. The archive was never meant to suggest hidden knowledge or forbidden books. It was the Pope's private archive, reserved for official church use. But over time, that distinction blurred, and secretum became the source of countless myths. The Vatican Apostolic Archive holds one of the largest collections of historical documents in the world. It contains over 50 miles of shelving and more than 80,000 manuscripts. These records include papal letters, political documents, church trials, and records of major events stretching back over 12 centuries. Some of the most famous documents in the archive include the excommunication of Martin Luther, letters from kings and emperors, and transcripts from the trial of Galileo Galilei. What it does not contain, at least publicly confirmed, is a vault of grimoires or forbidden magical texts. But the old name gave many people reason to believe otherwise. The term Vatican Secret Archive first appeared in common use in the 17th century. At the time, it was accurate. It referred to the fact that the documents were the private property of the Pope, not open to the general public, or even to all members of the Church. But as modern languages evolved, the word secret took on new meanings. It began to imply intentional hiding, mystery, or conspiracy. As a result, the Vatican's archive became a favorite subject for those who believed the Church was hiding ancient truths. Films, novels, and conspiracy theories used the idea of a secret archive to tell stories of lost gospels, occult rituals, and forbidden books locked deep beneath the Vatican. By renaming the archive in 2019, the Church attempted to clarify its role. Pope Francis stated that the change would help prevent misunderstandings and reflect the archive's true nature as a service to scholars and the Church. The new name, Vatican Apostolic Archive, connects the institution to its role as a keeper of apostolic tradition rather than a chamber of secrets. It also helped separate it from the popular fantasy of a hidden magical library buried under Rome. Even with the name change, the mystery has not disappeared. Because the archive remains closed to most people, the belief persists that something more is inside, that perhaps secretum did mean secret after all. This is the power of language. A single word can carry centuries of weight, and even when corrected, its shadow still lingers in the public mind. The Vatican Apostolic Archive may not be hiding grimoires, but the idea that it once did remains stronger than the facts. When people imagine a forbidden book disappearing, they picture fire, a dramatic burning, pages turned to ash, secrets lost forever in smoke. But that is not how most manuscripts vanish. The truth is quieter, slower, more ordinary. The most common way a manuscript disappears is not by destruction, but by transformation. A book does not have to be burned to be lost. It can be miscatalogued, split apart, recopied without credit, or simply shelved in the wrong place. And when that happens, its identity fades, piece by piece, until it no longer looks like the book it once was. In the world of medieval manuscripts, there was no standard format, no ISBN numbers, no centralized library database. Books were copied by hand, often by scribes who changed wording, added prayers, or left parts out entirely. A single work might be copied dozens of times with small variations. Then those copies would be bound, sold, or stored in private libraries. Over time, the book's name might change. A section could be removed and treated as its own text, or a new introduction might be added, making it seem like an entirely different work. The result is that many grimoires we think of as lost may still exist, just not under the names we expect. Even something as simple as rebinding can erase a book's past. A scribe might take pages from different sources and sew them together. One section could be Solomonic, another alchemical, and a third Christian devotional. Together, they form a new book. When catalogued centuries later, the manuscript might be labeled as theological or scientific, with no mention of its magical content. The original Solomonic text is still there, hidden in plain sight, but no one knows to look for it. This process happened in private collections, monastic libraries, and royal archives across Europe. During wars and political shifts, libraries were looted or sold. Books were moved from one country to another. Languages changed. Pages were damaged or lost. A grimoire written in Latin in the 14th century might be copied in German, in the 15th, then translated into French in the 16th, with entire sections removed. By the time it reaches the present, it no longer resembles the original manuscript, but it still carries fragments of it, symbols, phrases, rituals, all hidden inside a new skin. Even modern libraries contribute to this quiet disappearance. If a manuscript is poorly catalogued or mislabeled, it may sit on a shelf unread for decades. Some libraries list magical texts under folklore. Others bury them in general theology. And if the book lacks a famous title or author, it is unlikely to draw attention. It simply waits, unrecognized. And as new scholarship focuses on more popular or better-known texts, these hidden pieces remain invisible. This is how a grimoire vanishes without burning. It fades through time, reshaped by hands that never meant to destroy it, only to use it. And in the process, its name, its form, and its story dissolve into something untraceable, not destroyed, but displaced, not erased, but forgotten. As interest in occult knowledge surged from the 18th through the 20th centuries, a new force began shaping the fate of Solomonic grimoires: the collector. What had once been secret manuals, copied quietly by monks and scholars, became rare objects of desire. Wealthy antiquarians, occult societies, and private buyers began searching for anything linked to Solomon, magic, or the Vatican. And where demand grows, distortion follows. The market for grimoires gave rise to exaggerated origin stories, deliberate forgeries, and bold claims that certain books came directly from the hidden shelves of Rome. The truth became harder to separate from invention. By the 18th century, Europe was experiencing a revival of interest in the esoteric. Secret societies, Masonic lodges, Rosicrucian groups, and later Theosophists all looked to ancient wisdom for authority. Grimoires associated with Solomon held special status because they seemed to bridge religion and magic. Owning one was not just about belief, it was about prestige. A book claimed to be ancient, forbidden, or Vatican hidden could command enormous value. This created a powerful incentive to embellish the past of any manuscript that looked even remotely magical. Dealers and collectors began attaching dramatic provenance stories to manuscripts. A book was no longer just a copy from the 17th century. It became a relic rescued from a monastery before the Inquisition arrived, or a text smuggled out of the Vatican library by a rogue priest, or a direct copy of Solomon's own writings, translated and retranslated through the ages. These stories were almost impossible to verify, especially when buyers wanted to believe them, and the name Vatican became the ultimate selling point. If a book could be linked to Rome, even loosely, its value multiplied. Forgeries soon followed. Skilled scribes produced manuscripts using old parchment, imitating medieval handwriting, and copying known Solomonic symbols from published sources. Some forgeries were crude, others were convincing enough to fool early scholars. Fake seals were added, dates were altered, marginal notes were written to suggest centuries of use. In some cases, genuine older texts were modified to appear more ancient or more dangerous than they really were. A harmless astrological manuscript might be adjusted with spirit names or ritual circles to make it seem like a forbidden grimoire. The 19th and early 20th centuries saw the rise of occult publishing houses and secret orders that further blurred the line. Groups like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn published versions of the Key of Solomon and the Lemegeton, often claiming access to ancient manuscripts. While many of these editions were based on real sources, they were also heavily edited, rearranged, and reinterpreted. Claims of Vatican origin were sometimes repeated without evidence, reinforcing the idea that Rome held the ultimate original texts. Over time, these claims entered popular culture and were rarely questioned. Modern scholarship has had to untangle this web. By comparing handwriting, ink, paper, and language, historians can now identify many forgeries and exaggerated claims. But the damage remains. The occult market turned the search for Solomonic grimoires into a gold rush, where myth often mattered more than fact. And in that environment, the idea of a lost Vatican grimoire grew larger than any single book ever could. For scholars trying to study magical texts in the Vatican collections, the biggest obstacle is not belief or theory. It is access. The Vatican Library and the Apostolic Archive are not like public libraries. Entry is limited, requests are screened, and even when permission is granted, it often comes with restrictions. You cannot just walk in and ask to see a grimoire. Researchers must apply months in advance, justify their topic, and work under tight supervision. And even then, what they can see is often incomplete. Pages might be missing. Descriptions might be vague. Some manuscripts are so fragile, they are off limits entirely. This makes deep research difficult and often frustrating. And that frustration is part of what keeps the public myth alive. Because when answers are partial, people imagine what might be hidden just beyond reach. In many cases, the only available material is a catalogue entry or a microfilm copy made decades ago. These are helpful, but rarely detailed enough to trace a full ritual structure or decode complex diagrams. Important symbols might be blurred. Marginal notes might be cut off. Language might be misread due to damage or faded ink. Without full access to the physical manuscript, scholars are forced to work from fragments. And fragments create more questions than answers. A partial diagram can suggest a missing ritual. A cut-off phrase can imply forbidden content. And in those gaps, speculation grows. This is not always the Vatican's fault. The library is home to thousands of ancient and delicate manuscripts. Some are too fragile to handle, others are being restored. But the effect is the same. Scholars often hit a dead end, unable to finish the picture they started. They leave with notes, theories, and guesses, but not with certainty. And this incomplete picture creates the perfect space for public fantasy. If even experts cannot access everything, what must be hiding deeper inside? This idea of the locked door just beyond the current one has fueled countless stories. Researchers become characters in the myth. Their limitations are taken as proof that the real pages must be somewhere else, that the true grimoire is behind the next level of clearance, that the Vatican is not just hard to study, but actively hiding something. The reality is far less dramatic. But when transparency is partial, mystery fills the gap. This is the scholar's dead end. Not because the knowledge is gone, but because it is behind layers of process, preservation, and permission. And as long as those layers exist, the myth will continue. The idea that the lost grimoire of Solomon is not lost at all, just sealed behind a gate that only a few will ever pass. The truth might be more mundane. But in the eyes of the public, every denied page becomes part of a larger, hidden book waiting to be found. The most grounded connection between the Vatican and the world of Solomonic magic is not based on secret vaults or missing grimoires. It is based on history, a thread that is fully verifiable. The Vatican played a dual role in European intellectual life for centuries. It preserved vast collections of manuscripts, including those that touched on astrology, angelology, and ceremonial magic. And at the same time, it acted as the final judge of what was theologically acceptable. It drew the lines between natural philosophy and forbidden practice. That combination of preservation and regulation placed the Vatican at the very center of how magical texts were managed, interpreted, and sometimes suppressed. From the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, the Church maintained one of the largest networks of libraries in Europe. Monasteries, cathedrals, and universities under Church influence collected books from many traditions. Some were translations from Greek or Arabic. Others were Christian commentaries or scientific treatises. Many of these works contained content that modern scholars would consider part of the magical tradition. Texts on the movement of the stars, the names of angels, or the effects of sacred words were studied as part of natural philosophy. As long as these ideas did not directly challenge doctrine or invoke spirits outside of Christian belief, they were tolerated. But once a text crossed that boundary, it entered dangerous territory. This is where the second part of the Vatican's role becomes clear. The Church created formal systems to judge and censor ideas. The most famous was the Index Librorum, Prohibitorum, or the Index of Forbidden Books, established in the 16th century and updated until the mid-20th century. Any book that the Church deemed spiritually harmful could be banned. This included many magical texts, particularly those that claimed to summon spirits, manipulate hidden forces, or bypass divine authority. Solomonic grimoires, especially those with rituals of conjuration, often fell into this category. At the same time, the Church rarely destroyed knowledge outright. Instead, it preserved it in limited settings. A book might be banned from public circulation, but kept in a monastic library. A text might be condemned by the Inquisition, but still copied by scholars under careful watch. In this way, the Vatican maintained control while avoiding complete erasure. This is why Solomonic material still exists today, not because it escaped the Church's attention, but because it was kept under its supervision. That preservation, even when motivated by control, helped these texts survive. The real connection is institutional. The Vatican was Europe's most powerful gatekeeper of sacred knowledge. It decided what could be taught, what could be printed, and what was heretical. And it held the archives that scholars now search for clues. That thread is not a conspiracy. It is a historical fact. And it explains why the Vatican appears in every serious conversation about the fate of magical texts, not because it hides them in the shadows, but because it shaped the boundaries that still define what is forbidden and what is preserved. For modern historians, the idea of a lost grimoire of Solomon has shifted from fantasy to methodology. Instead of searching for a single hidden book locked away in a vault, scholars now approach the problem as one of reconstruction. The goal is not to find one perfect manuscript, but to understand what earlier versions must have looked like by comparing the many copies that survived. This approach treats Solomonic magic as a living textual tradition, shaped over centuries, rather than a single object waiting to be discovered. Researchers begin by identifying manuscript families. These are groups of texts that share common features, such as similar prayers, identical diagrams, or the same order of rituals. By comparing these families across libraries in Italy, France, Germany, England, and the Vatican, patterns emerge. When the same structure appears in multiple manuscripts from different regions and time periods, it suggests that they all descend from an earlier source. That source may no longer exist, but its outline can be inferred. This is how scholars slowly rebuild what has been lost, not by discovery, but by comparison. This process is similar to how ancient biblical texts are studied. No original gospel manuscripts survive, yet scholars can reconstruct early versions by comparing later copies. The same method applies to grimoires. If 3 manuscripts share the same angelic invocation, but differ slightly in wording, historians can identify which phrases are likely original and which are later additions. If a diagram appears in one family but not another, it may indicate a regional innovation rather than an ancient core element. Over time, these small details add up to a clearer picture of the tradition's early form. Technology has accelerated this work. Digital archives allow scholars to compare manuscripts that were once separated by thousands of miles. High-resolution images reveal erased text, overwritten symbols, and marginal notes invisible to the naked eye. Linguistic analysis helps date layers of writing within a single manuscript. Even ink composition and parchment quality can suggest whether a page belongs to an older or later phase of copying. All of this data feeds into a growing scholarly consensus. There was no single lost grimoire. There was a network of early texts that slowly merged into what we now call Solomonic magic. This approach also explains why the search for a Vatican hidden book never ends. People expect a dramatic reveal, a single codex that answers every question. But history rarely works that way. Knowledge survives in fragments, and those fragments must be patiently assembled. The lost grimoire is not an object behind a locked door. It is a puzzle spread across shelves, languages, and centuries. By treating the problem as reconstruction rather than recovery, historians have moved past myth. They now see the Solomonic tradition not as a secret withheld by one institution, but as a shared intellectual heritage shaped by many hands. And in that sense, the lost grimoire is slowly being found, not all at once, but page by page, comparison by comparison, until its outline becomes clear enough to understand. If a lost grimoire of Solomon were ever to be proven real, scholars agree that belief would not be enough. Proof would have to meet strict standards, not legends, not rumors, not claims of Vatican secrecy. Real evidence would need to stand on its own, the same way any serious historical discovery does. And when researchers talk about proof, they are very clear about what that would mean. It would not be a dramatic reveal. It would be a slow, careful confirmation built from multiple hard criteria working together. The first requirement would be datable handwriting. Paleography, the study of ancient writing styles, allows experts to determine when and where a manuscript was written. If a Solomonic text appeared with handwriting that clearly dated earlier than all known copies, and if that dating was confirmed by multiple specialists, it would change the entire field. The script would need to match a specific region and century without relying on guesswork. A forgery can imitate style, but it often fails under close comparison. Real proof must survive that level of scrutiny. The second requirement would be consistent diagrams. Solomonic grimoires are filled with circles, seals, and symbols. These diagrams are often the most altered parts of the tradition. A genuine early text would likely show a stable core set of symbols that later manuscripts modify, rather than invent. If an unknown manuscript contained diagrams that clearly explain the variations seen in later copies, rather than copying them, it would suggest an earlier position in the tradition. That kind of consistency is extremely difficult to fake. The third requirement would be traceable ownership. A manuscript does not exist in isolation. It moves through hands. Monasteries, scholars, private collectors, libraries. If a document could be traced through records, such as inventories, letters, or library catalogues over several centuries, its authenticity would grow stronger. Gaps can exist, but the overall chain must make sense. A book that suddenly appears with no history is not proof. A book that leaves footprints across time is. The final requirement would be a clear stemma. This is a family tree of manuscripts. Scholars would need to show how this text explains the differences between known versions without relying on myth. The stemma must account for additions, omissions, and regional changes logically. If a manuscript can be shown to sit at the root of that tree, rather than on one of its branches, it would be powerful evidence, not magic, structure. This is why the hunt remains unresolved. Not because proof is impossible, but because the bar is high. And it must be. History does not accept legends. It accepts patterns, consistency, and evidence that survives doubt. Until all these criteria are met together, the lost grimoire remains a scholarly question, not a discovered object. The story of the lost grimoire of Solomon does not end with a grand reveal or a hidden vault beneath the Vatican. It ends with uncertainty, a quiet, lingering question that never fully disappears. The Vatican may not be hiding a single master book. There is no confirmed manuscript that unlocks all others. But its libraries, along with the vast and uneven manuscript collections across Europe, create a space where that possibility can never be completely ruled out. The result is a tension that never quite resolves, an ending that refuses to close. Throughout this series, the threads have pointed to a complex reality. Solomonic texts exist. They were copied, customized, and circulated for centuries. Some versions ended up in private hands, others in university archives, and some in the Vatican itself. But what no one has found is the original, the manuscript that came first, the one that explains the rest. Scholars call it an archetype. Researchers call it a hypothesis. The public calls it the lost grimoire. And that difference in language is exactly the problem. Academic caution clashes with public imagination. One side builds a puzzle from fragments. The other wants a complete map. The Vatican stands at the center of this tension, not just because of its historical role, but because of how people perceive it. As both preserver and censor, it becomes the perfect backdrop for stories of hidden knowledge. Its gates and permissions create the appearance of something always just out of reach. That is enough to keep the legend alive, even if the reality is more mundane. Even if the manuscripts it holds are known, catalogued, and open to scholars under strict conditions. It is the gaps that matter now. The parts of European manuscript history that were never recorded, never preserved, or simply lost over time. Libraries were burned, collections were scattered during wars, entire monastic archives disappeared. Within those disappearances, the idea of the grimoire survives, not as proof, but as possibility. This is what makes the story so hard to end. Because no matter how many texts are studied, how many catalogues are read, or how many rituals are traced, there is always one more shelf, one more fragment, one more lead that might point backward to the source. This unresolved tension is not a flaw. It is part of what makes the subject so powerful. The grimoire is not just a book. It is a symbol, a representation of forbidden knowledge, half-remembered truth, and the human desire to know what has been hidden. The ending of this investigation is not a conclusion. It is an invitation to keep searching, to keep asking, and to understand that some shadows do not need to be fully lit to be meaningful. In the end, the lost Grimoire of Solomon may not exist as a single manuscript, but it exists as a mirror held up to history, reflecting the boundary between what was written, what was erased, and what still waits to be found. That is why this story does not close. It stays open, always.